We are getting close to the end of December, and that means different things for different people. Anyone with seasonal affective disorder is getting hella depressed, Christians are getting ready to celebrate Christmas, and Fire Emblem YouTubers are preparing to make their annual video about the Christmas Cavalier archetype. But I've already made 2 Christmas Cav videos, and I feel like they've explored the archetype in every which way I possibly could. So instead of treading on that recycled ground, I'm going to talk about one of the Christmas ninjas, specifically Saizo, as was voted on by my patrons. So pour yourself a glass of hot cocoa, help yourself to some of Granny's freshly baked gingerbread cookies, and lend me your ear while I spin you a classic Christmas tale about a man who liked to explode himself. But before we begin, this video is part of an ongoing series where I'm doing a deep dive into every unit in the Revelation cast. If you're interested in looking at some of the previous units I've covered, they are in a playlist linked below, and if you'd like to vote on who gets covered next, consider supporting me on Patreon, where $5 and above backers have the ability to vote on not only REV-iews, but other stuff affecting the channel. With that being said, let's dive into today's unit, REV-iew. Saizo joins your army in Chapter 11 alongside Reina and Orochi, and he sort of sits as a middle ground between the two of them. He doesn't come off as pathetic as Orochi does, but at the same time, comparing anyone to Reina is going to make them look pretty bad. His base stats and growths are a fairly balanced spread, with 11 strength, 12 speed, 9 luck, 9 defense, and 8 resistance. The only standout areas are Saizo's 15 skill, which is good, and his 3 magic, which is bad, but honestly better than you might expect for a physical unit. And he has a 45% magic growth to back that up, so eventually he can do some decent chip with the Flame Shuriken if you have no better user for it. On the surface, this stat spread seems pretty alright. Saizo doesn't really have any notable weaknesses to exploit. Sure, 23 HP isn't the greatest, but HP values in Fates are low across the board, and he can supplement this with his defense and resistance, both of which are quite good. But in my opinion, it's almost always better to be a specialist than a generalist, and unfortunately, Saizo falls into the latter category. He doesn't really have any major selling point other than decent bases and growth rates hovering around 50%, promising that if you continue to train him, he'll probably keep pace with the rest of your army. Although, arguably, he doesn't really keep pace with enemies, and that's because, on the harder difficulties of Revelation, enemies scale really quickly. Even on Saizo's join map, he can find himself struggling to output the type of damage you want, and the promoted Master Ninjas will double him and nearly one-round him. There are games where balanced stats can work. Typically, these are titles with lower enemy quality, like Path of Radiance, Blazing Sword, or Saizo's native game, Birthright, where he is one of the more dominant units in the cast. But when it comes to fighting the incredibly OP enemies of Revelation, you kind of want to min-max. Being balanced means you don't have a weakness to patch up, but it also means you're not really offering much in terms of reasons to add you to the team. Although, in Saizo's case, that isn't entirely accurate, because while his stats aren't anything phenomenal, he is, at the very least, in a quite good class, especially for the early game. You see, Ninja is the only unpromoted line that has access to daggers and shurikens, which are 1-2 range weapons that can debuff enemies. This means, against most foes, Saizo can ensure that he does chip damage without being countered. And the debuffing effect is actually relevant in Revelation, since, unlike Conquest and Birthright, enemies tend to be beefy enough that lowering their speed to allow someone else to double, or defense to allow someone else to deal extra damage, can be the difference maker between 2-rounding and 3-rounding a foe. Not only that, but Ninja's level 10 skill, Poison Strike, is much more relevant here than in the other two routes. Especially early on before you've trained up super units, getting some free chip damage anytime you initiate is a godsend. It makes fighting the Berserkers of Chapter 12 or the Generals of Chapters 13 and 14 much easier. And if Saizo still has a spot on your squad by Chapter 14, you can also give him the Hunter's Knife for effective damage against Paladins and Cavaliers. Although that is a fairly significant gold investment, and it's worth acknowledging, this isn't a trait unique to Saizo. Even ignoring possible reclass options depending on support routing, Saizo joins after Kaze, the green ninja, and directly before Kagero, who is also a ninja. And each of these characters tend to specialize much better than Saizo does. Kagero is basically a berserker in ninja form. She has super high strength and speed in order to totally destroy foes, but very low skill, so she needs assistance in the accuracy department. Kaze, on the other hand, has a bit of a noodle arm, although this can sometimes be exaggerated, but very potent speed and resistance stats, making him not only able to double the fastest of foes, but also an extremely effective counter to mages. And Revelation has a disproportionate number of magical enemies as compared to most other Fire Emblem games. Saizo seems to have been intended to be the physically bulky ninja, but unfortunately he doesn't really do this job super well, since his low speed prevents him from doubling, and in my experience, ninjas get most of their bulk from doubling and building guard gauge instead of raw stats. Saizo's stats just aren't good enough to stand up to a large onslaught of Rev enemies. Because Saizo's niche is much less effective than Kaze's or Kagero's, if you're looking for someone to fill in as a Poison Strike debuffer or a Hunter's Knife user, then he's probably your last option. It's definitely possible that you want a third on your team, after all Ninja is a very desirable class, but with the honestly quite restrictive deployment slots that Rev offers you, I find that frequently Saizo doesn't make the cut unless I'm planning some other form of high investment build for him. Thus is the curse of balanced stats. Ironically, despite Ninja being probably Saizo's most desirable quality, it's also arguably his biggest weakness, because Saizo's stat spread is not exactly tailored to the Ninja class line. His personal stats run directly counter to the Ninja build. He has abysmal personal speed, with a base of 4 and a growth rate of 30%, gaining the majority of his quickness from Ninja itself. Additionally, his resistance is also not all that good if you don't account for Ninja bonuses. He has a 5 base, which is alright, but the 10% growth means that this will not keep up going forward. On the contrary, Saizo's defense and strength are both phenomenal. He has 8 personal strength and a 55% strength growth. Likewise, his personal defense base of 6 is quite good, as is the 45% personal growth. If Saizo could enter into a class that cared much more about strength or defense, then he would be able to take his rightful place as a specialist instead of a generalist. But unfortunately, both Saizo's base class of ninja and his Heartseal class of samurai are meant to be fast classes, not strong ones. So instead, Saizo should look for his supports to see what other options are available. The most obvious first option is Oni Savage from Rinkah, as that's kind of the Hoshiden equivalent to Armor Knight. This is actually a pretty nice glow up for Saizo. He gets 14 base strength with a 70% growth, and 13 base defense with a 65% growth. His speed is absolutely in the gutter with 9 base and 40% growth, but you can fix that with rallies, tonics, and pair-ups, or simply by allowing the enemy to double you and just shrugging it off. Promoting from Oni Savage to Oni Chieftain also gives Saizo an outlet for his magic growth, since he can use tomes instead of requiring you to purchase an expensive magic weapon that isn't all that good on him anyway. This is a fine, if unexciting, role for the red ninja to end up in. He kinda just ends up marrying Rinkah so he can become a better version of her. But the biggest problem is it requires Saizo to marry Rinkah, which means it's not going to come online until you've deployed Saizo and Rinkah together for at least 7 maps, which is a very big time commitment. For context, that is every story map from the time that Saizo joins until the time that Fuga joins. And if you're just getting a Master of Arms online when Fuga joins, well, let's just say Saizo's stats aren't going to compare to REV's real GOAT generalist. Now, in fairness, if you are dead set on using Oni Saizo, at the very least, Oni Savage Backpack makes for a good supplement to a ninja. So Saizo can function as a quite effective tank with Rinkah's support. But on the other hand, both Kaze and Jacob would use this backpack better, and can reach the marriage threshold faster than Saizo since they're available for more maps together. Kaze even likely has a head start from Branch of Fate. It's a kind of ironic role reversal, because in Birthright, pairing Rinkah with Kaze feels like a waste since she works with Saizo and Jacob much better, but in Revelation, giving her to Saizo feels like a waste because she works with Kaze and Jacob much better. I guess Jacob wins in every timeline, except for the Felicia timelines. And if we're not spending Rinkah Marriage on him, Saizo's options look a lot less appealing. Sakura gives him Monk, which can allow him to early promote to Great Master, and that is a class that has quite good bases, but it also requires instant promoting Saizo, which is likely going to cut into his long term. Great Master bonuses aren't so great as to make up for 10 levels worth of stats. And unfortunately, Saizo really needs the stats. While other units can often get away with an early promotion, he kinda can't. Similarly, Oboro Marriage feels like a downgrade or at best a side grade, as Spear Fighter is not a particularly good class. Stat-wise, he mostly ends up as just a slightly better generalist than he was in Ninja, but since he uses a much worse weapon type in Lances as opposed to Shurikens, and he doesn't even have the rank for Beast Killer without some training, it feels like a wash. The most promising looking class option for Saizo is Archer, which he can acquire either by marrying Mozu or Setsuna. Although considering Setsuna's join time is so late, it's probably best to get this class from Mozu. Archer itself is an incredibly solid class. It grants access to bows, which is one of the best weapon types, has a phenomenal level 10 skill in Quick Draw, and has 2 equally great promotion options. Kinshi Knight if you want to be a flyer, and Sniper if you'd rather stay grounded with good stats. Sniper not only offers bow fare at level 15, but also certain blow at level 5, which highly increases accuracy on player face. And while skill is already one of Saizo's strong suits, getting certain blow means that he's able to wield the less accurate and more powerful Yumis, or potentially even fight enemies at weapon triangle disadvantage while still maintaining perfect accuracy. On the other hand, Kinshi Knight offers flight, which is a huge boon considering the mid-game and late game of Rev contains a lot of maps where you want a good deal of flyers. The main downside of Kinshi Knight is that its class bases are kind of horrendous, so you really need to bring your own stats to the party. And thankfully, with the exception of speed, Saizo is more than capable of doing this. In fact, in many ways, Kinshi Knight is sort of the perfect use case for Saizo's generalist stat spread, as it lets him buffer every area that the class would otherwise be weak in. Unfortunately, his speed is still probably going to suffer, But there is a fairly trivial path to fixing this, and that is by pursuing Saizo's friendship with Tsubaki, granting him access to the Sky Knight class. You see, Sky Knight gets Darting Blow at level 10, meaning that on player phase, Saizo would get 5 additional speed. And because friendships are completed faster than marriages, in theory, you could have Saizo acquire Sky Knight from Tsubaki friendship, start working his way towards Darting Blow, and then promote into Kinshi Knight, which would grant him free access to the Archer skills upon marrying Mozu, since both Archer and Sky Knight can promote into Kinshi. Alternatively, if you're not a fan of using Tsubaki or just have different friendship routings planned for him, you can have Saizo friendship Laszlo in order to get the mercenary line, giving him access to Bow Knight, Kinshi Knight, and Sniper for the trifecta of good bow classes. And as a bonus on top, Saizo does also natively have Mechanist for bow access in a 4th class, but in my opinion, this is just a worse option. Like, don't get me wrong, Bow Knight is generically good, but if Saizo's already marrying Mozu and getting Archer, then Bow Knight feels a lot less appealing. Like, you've already got Sniper and Kinshi, your bases are basically covered there. That being said, a bow build for Saizo is generically good, and if all you want is to find a way to fit him on your team, it'll do. But it's not anything special. Like, I'm sure you've heard me rattle off this exact build recommendation for every Tom, Dick, and Harry stuck in the mid-tiers of Rev. And moreover, because of how strong an Archer-based build is, Mozu Marriage is super competitive. If there's any physical male that you want to put in a player phase role, it's at least worth considering grabbing Archer from the Villager Girl. Setsuna is a nice backup option, but since she joins in Chapter 17, anyone who doesn't have a fast support with her is spending a ton of time in their base class, and that's something that Saizo often wants to avoid. Although, maybe I'm looking at this the wrong way. Ninja is a really good class, so it seems like a shame to throw it away just because the physically bulky ninja role isn't exactly in high demand. So what if I lean into Saizo's strengths and try to turn him into an enemy phase god? Saizo already comes with Samurai in his base kit, so I can grab the exceptionally powerful Vantage skill by simply using a Heart Seal. Or if your Heart Seal economy is tight, Saizo and Kaze have a friendship with each other that they can each use to grab the other's Samurai talent. This does feel like a bit of a waste since it limits the number of class options they have access to, but the increased flexibility for getting the Vantage skill is certainly nice. From here, Saizo can start pursuing his Norian relationships. He gets Mercenary from Laszlo and Fighter from Charlotte, so he can combine Strong Riposte, HP plus 5, and Soul to turn into the ultimate Soul Ninja. And for your 5th skill slot, you can either equip Good Fortune for a little bit of random healing, or keep Lock Touch, which has nice utility on any chest map. Supplement this with a Berserker Charlotte backpack for a boost to your strength and speed, as well as potentially a rally before sending Saizo into enemy territory, and you've got a pretty good enemy phase unit. Although, I'll be honest, turning into a Soul Ninja also isn't exactly unique in Rev, and it's a role that requires pretty impressive stats, something that Saizo struggles with. Given all of his growth rates are coin flips, it's possible that you get a defense blessed or speed blessed Saizo and end up having someone who is capable of taking on hordes of foes, but if we're looking at pure averages, most of the time Saizo is going to fall short, even with a Berserker Charlotte pair-up. If you're willing to put in even more extra effort, you can try to nudge things in your favor by getting Astra as a 5th skill instead of Good Fortune or Lock Touch, but even then, I would say that Saizo ends up being a very RNG dependent character in the Soul Ninja build. and that's just not where you want to be in a game with no turn wheels or save points. Of course, Vantage isn't the only powerful enemy phase skill from the Samurai line. If you get Saizo to level 15 in Master of Arms, he also gets Life and Death, and can try to turn into a Vantage Life and Death sweeper. A Mechanist with a Steel Shuriken does slightly better than a Master of Arms with a Kodachi, but depending on your seal economy, either one works, since Saizo gets access to both Sword Fare and Shuriken Fare. In addition to Vantage, Life and Death, and the Fare of your choice, he could round things off with Strong Riposte from Mercenary, and Strength +2 from Wyvern. Although, I'll be honest, even with all of these buffs, Rev enemies are tough, and so it's unlikely that Saizo is able to score the one-shot. And if you're doing a Vantage build, when you don't one-shot, you die. So we once again hit a bit of a roadblock, but not an insurmountable one. If you've been watching my recent REV-iews, then you know about the dual Vantage attack stance strategy. Basically, how this works is you set up two Vantage sweepers and put them side by side so they are in attack stance. Then, no matter which one of them gets hit, they will always do a pair-up attack with each other. And even though the attack stance partner only deals 50% damage, a 1.5 times multiplier is more than you get from most backpacks. Another nice benefit of this is you get an accuracy boost for fighting in attack stance, so it's a lot easier to reach the coveted 100% accuracy, which is also a must-have for Vantage builds since missing equals death. Saizo doesn't have that many options for a good Vantage partner. There is the possibility of using his son, Asugi, since you could pass Vantage down and not have to worry about learning it on both of them. But if Saizo is marrying Baruka in order to get Strength +2, then that kind of screws over his son's Strength stat. And Asugi is going to have trouble assembling the 5 skills you need to be a good Vantage sweeper, since Gen 2 units naturally get their supports online later than Gen 1. Another possibility is his brother Kaze, and they could be a fun Christmas-themed DVAS build, but unfortunately, Kaze doesn't really have the strength stat to make this build work. I do think that the rumors of his noodle armness are sometimes exaggerated, but they are there for a reason. Instead, I would argue that really the only viable options for Saizo are Ryoma, with whom he has a fast support, or Orochi, since she also often likes going into a super Vantage build. Although, she is a much higher investment unit since she needs to marry one of the 2 male swordmasters, and so you would end up in a situation where not only are you marrying the 2 of them off to different people, but then you have to start building their support up to get to A rank for the maximum attack stance boost. It's definitely a doable combination, but one that feels far too high investment for the payoff you get. At that point, honestly, I would just go for the funny Orochi replicate build where she is a DVAS partner with herself. Although, even if Saizo's Vantage build with Orochi is a bit of a failure, that doesn't necessarily mean he can get nothing from this pairing. Because Orochi is the fastest route to access the Diviner class line, and therefore the easiest way for Saizo to be a mage. This sounds kind of crazy because Saizo is a physical unit, but his personal magic growth of 45% is impressive. When he's a diviner, Saizo's magic is therefore 60%, and as a Omnioji, he's able to reach 65%. And combine this with more reasonable defenses than you would expect on an Omnioji, and Saizo can end up being a pretty competent mage. Or at least that's what I would say if it weren't for his magic base. Now, don't get me wrong, 3 magic is impressive for a physical unit, and it means once Saizo switches gears into Diviner, he ends up with a base of 7. But 7 base magic isn't actually all that good. For context, this is 2 points lower than Hayato, and while Saizo has a 5% magic growth lead, that's not going to be a huge difference maker at the end of the day. 5% is just 1 point over 20 levels, which means Saizo doesn't actually catch up to Hayato on average. If you want to go this route with Saizo, it's not terrible. Basara is a decently bulky class, and Onryoji gives access to Tomefair to buff his damage, but it's important to remember that Marriage takes 7 maps. So even if we disregard the partner seal cost, Saizo's still gonna be stuck as a ninja for quite a while. You can cut this down a little bit by taking advantage of his fast support with Kagero. Since Diviner is her Heart Seal class, she can pass it on to Saizo for a mage build, but that still means he's spending 6 maps in Ninja instead of Diviner, which means you either sandbag Saizo and have to train him up as an underleveled scrub in the mid-game, or you just accept that the gap between him and the people who start as mages is going to extend, because not only is he operating on a lower base, but his growths get hampered for 6 maps. Either way, it's not an appealing proposition, and I already don't like the Diviner line as compared to Dark Mage, the far superior magical class. The worst part about this situation is because Saizo can only get Diviner from Marriage instead of Friendship, it means he can't also marry Baruka, which would allow him to access Malignite as a flying mage with access to Tomefair, a relatively rare combination. But while Malignite might not be useful for Mage Saizo, it's not something that you should rule out entirely, because it is a key feature of Saizo's funniest and uniquest role, the Self-Immolation Man. You see, Saizo has a very interesting personal skill. Pyrotechnics means that anytime he is at half HP or lower, and he initiates an attack on player phase, both he and any foes within 2 spaces will lose 20% of their max HP. This damage can never be lethal, so Saizo can fire off attacks at 1 HP without worry, but as a downside, it's also never going to kill foes. At best, it reduces them to 1 HP. I've seen some people label this as a downside, and it is occasionally a limitation, but it's important to remember that this only occurs on player phase. So for the most part, you have full control over whether or not Pyrotechnics procs. If you value Saizo's HP in the current moment, then you don't want to attack if he's at half or lower. Meanwhile, if you don't care about the extra damage dealt, but think it would be beneficial to deal some chip yourself, then Saizo is free to explode. And because HP values are so low in Fates, it's actually surprisingly easy to manage the 50% threshold by using something like a Physics Staff or a Wayne Festal, even though they don't heal for much. This on its own is already pretty good, especially since it combos with the aforementioned Poison Strike to reduce enemies' HP by 40%. And as such, if Saizo attacks an enemy to soften them up for the next unit, you can nearly guarantee that they will be 2-rounded, which is especially useful against the super bulky generals of the mid-game or the Onis of the late game. If you are just deploying Saizo for some filler combat or to complete a friendship or marriage chain, then this is probably a good enough free contribution to justify his slot. But if you want to go all in on the Saizo explosion train, you can have him marry Baruka, who is a unit that appreciates access to ninja, and give him the Malignite class, which at level 5 will grant Savage Blow, yet another ability that deals 20% damage upon initiation. And as such, all units within a 2-tile radius will take 40% damage from a Saizo explosion, and the direct target will take 60%. The most obvious use case of this build is to take down the aforementioned bulky enemies, But since it comes online so late, I think it secretly has a second, equally fun use case, and that is to intentionally reduce enemies to 1 HP without killing them. That way, if a unit is doing class-dipping shenanigans to add to their skill set, such as Master of Arms Orochi or Cavalier Kaze, you are able to secure the kills they need more easily in order to spend as little time as possible in undesirable classes. This is probably going to be the primary use of Saizo's full 60% explosion, since by the time you get him into Malignite and learn Savage Blow, most of your units are going to be strong enough that they don't need the 60% in their primary class. But it still has this niche application, and if nothing else, it is very funny. Plus, Saizo can often safely initiate combat from Malignite since he's a flyer and gains access to magic tomes. Remember, even if he ends up dealing 0 damage, these 60% will still proc upon returning to the map. So you can get the hilarious moment of a 0 damage attack from Saizo, resulting in an absolute nuke anyway, thus turning this Saizo build into a Chimera archetype. Ultimately, because that is Saizo's most unique build, it's what I would recommend you do with him. But if you're not a fan of self-immolation and still want to use the Red Christmas Ninja, it's worth acknowledging that there are 3 more class options I haven't touched upon that Saizo has. He can bring his incredibly balanced class stats into Hero, Berserker, or Wyvern Lord. These aren't exactly build options in the same way that Exploding Saizo or Bow Saizo are, but it does give you a relatively fine filler combat unit at the cost of some support routing and a reclass seal. Of these 3, in my opinion, Wyvern Lord is probably the best. Baruka joins pretty shortly after Saizo, so you can build the support relatively quickly, and much like with Kinsey Knight, flight is usually quite desirable in Rev. Although, it's worth acknowledging that you usually don't care for flying classes for the last 5 maps of the game, since at that point, all of the action has moved indoors, and flight is just a liability due to the large number of bow enemies. And going Wyvern doesn't give Saizo an especially good grounded option, although I guess Master of Arms works since it can take advantage of the axe rank you've surely built up while riding a dragon. Berserker and Hero, on the other hand, despite being grounded, can do some good work. I'm personally much more partial to Hero because I get annoyed by Berserker's crit avoid penalty, and Hero is usually a more accurate class than Berserker is, but since Saizo has a ridiculous skill stat, I think he'll be fine either way. And it is undeniably funny to see Saizo's face on a super buff body. I recommend trying it out at least once. Now, that's really all there is to say about Saizo, but I'm not going to end the video here because I want to talk about his son, Asugi. Both because they're incredibly similar units, and therefore having 2 separate videos would feel kind of redundant, but also because in comparing their similarities and differences, we can kind of highlight what makes the Gen 2 units different from Gen 1 ones. Specifically in that the 2nd generation has slightly more customizable stats than the 1st gen, and the 2nd generation has an easier time acquiring skill combinations that would normally require a bunch of class dipping. The trade-off, of course, is because child units require their parents to get married, they tend to have lower availability and are not as great in high investment roles since you have less time to build up supports and do class dipping. In Saizo's case, the majority of his builds, other than self-immolation, range from medium investment to low investment, and as such, Asugi operating as a Generation 2 version of his father ends up becoming a almost strict upgrade aside from join time. But let's start at the beginning. Without influence from his mother, Asugi's stats are painfully average. Much like Saizo, he has 50% growths in almost everything, and his bases aren't all that much of a standout either. Asugi's main weakness is defense instead of speed, but you can, of course, fiddle with this depending on what parent you give him. If you want to turn Asugi into an offensive powerhouse, marry Saizo to Mozu, Charlotte, or Kagero. Meanwhile, if you'd rather focus on defensive bulk, Birthright is probably the best option. Heck, if you're feeling spicy and got a hankering for magical Asugi, both Sakura and Orochi are potential candidates for that. As such, while Saizo's exceedingly average stat spread kind of weighs him down, Asugi's is more of a strength than a weakness, since he never actually ends up with his unmodified stats. Instead, he will always have whatever version you have tailored to make your perfect ninja. And if you're not in the mood for another ninja, Asugi can much more easily get access to a different class, such as Fighter, Wyvern, or even Diviner. And while I'm low on Diviner Saizo, I actually kind of like it on Asugi, even though he faces similar issues to his dad by auto-leveling a ninja. My main reason is that he has a slightly higher base and slightly higher growth. It's not a huge difference. With Sakura Mom, he has a 50% magic growth, whereas with Orochi, 57%. But it's just enough to tip things in his favor so that he'll still have a reasonable magic stat when you reclass him to Diviner. And Asugi has such a good personal speed stat that even Orochi's abysmal growths don't screw him over. In Ninja, he ends up with a 50% speed growth if he has Orochi-Mom, which, when combined with his reasonable bases, as well as stat inheritance from his parents, means that he should be on track to remain in a reasonable speed tier for the rest of the campaign. Although, if you're nervous about missing doubling thresholds, you can go for Sakura Mom, as she will improve his speed in exchange for worsening his magic. The main reason you would want to go for Magical Asugi instead of leaning into the ninja role is competent mages are actually quite rare in REV. You get Hayato fairly early on, but Orochi is not great, and Nyx and Odin are even worse. Leo is nice, but he shows up pretty late in the campaign, and to be honest, does come with some of his own problems. So if you don't want Hayato to be your only mage, your options are pretty limited. You can do a high investment build with Sakura, or you can reclass Felicia into a magical glass cannon. But if you went with female Corrin or don't feel like investing the resources in either of these two staffers, then Generation 1 doesn't have much to offer you in the way of mages. So grabbing one from Gen 2 is a nice way to fill this hole in your army. And Asugi has the Lock Touch skill thanks to his native ninja class, so he'll provide that niche benefit as well as being a slightly bulkier option than you might expect from most mages. It's not the most impressive or unique thing for a kid to do, but it fills a necessary niche, and that's good for him. Of course, if you'd rather have Asugi deal out physical damage, there's a much simpler path to that. Kagero Mother makes Asugi into basically a clone of her. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's functional. Although personally, I would recommend going for Charlotte Mom, if for no other reason than because she has access to additional skills such as HP plus 5 that he might want. Of course, there is one other skill that Charlotte can potentially pass him, and that is Soul. Although, if you're trying to make Asugi into a Soul Ninja, I don't think Charlotte is the correct mother. Instead, that is a task best suited for Birthright. If Birthright reclasses into Hero, then she can pass Soul down to her child. Similarly, Saizo can reclass into Samurai to pass down Vantage. As such, Asugi is capable of inheriting two skills that are well suited to the Soul Ninja build without ever needing to reclass himself. Now, he's far from the only unit capable of adding Samurai, Ninja, and Hero together, But the advantage to doing things this way is it only costs you 2 heart seals, whereas if you were to do it with someone else, they would require bare minimum 3 and usually 4 if you want to end up in a dagger class at the end of the day. And while Asugi's natural bulk isn't exactly what I would call stellar, with help from Birthright Mother, he does end up reasonably bulky, especially when you consider that most of Ninja's bulk comes from doubling with guard gauge. And despite Birthright's terrible speed, Asugi offsets that and is still very fast as a Master Ninja. As such, this is a pretty reasonable place for him to end up. But it is worth acknowledging the downside that this build has for Asugi specifically. Because he is inheriting Soul from Birthright, Asugi doesn't actually gain access to the hero class. And as such, unlike other potential Soul ninjas, he misses out on either HP plus 5 or Strong Riposte, which you would normally have access to depending on whether it's a mercenary hero or a fighter hero. And while it's definitely possible to be an enemy phase sweeper without these 2 specific skills, it makes things trickier. You could, of course, have Asugi grab Strength plus 2 and Trample from the Wyvern line, but in order to do so, you're spending 2 heart seals, which offsets the advantage that Asugi offers. Combine this with the fact that Soul Ninja is at its weakest in the Rev route, and I don't think this is a terribly compelling build for the Child of Saizo. Instead, as boring as it is, I'd much rather just put him in a generically good class and have him ride his generically good stats. Birthright is still a decent mother for Asugi, but rather than focusing on Soul Ninja, I think you just give him Wyvern. As it turns out, Wyvern is usually a good option in Fire Emblem. I guess I should also touch upon Asugi's personal skill, since this gives him a slight edge in the generic combat role. It's pretty unimpactful, that's why it hasn't come up until now, but whenever he uses weight, he recovers 4 HP, and this can sometimes make the difference in terms of bulk thresholds. It's going to depend on his defense and enemy strength and all that stuff, but 4 HP is a meaningful amount in Fates, since HP is pretty universally low, generally in the 20 to 30 range, so 4 HP can be a big difference, but it's also like, you have to spend your turn waiting. I don't think it's a huge deal. I think the bigger strength that Asugi has going for him is his stats are good. That's kind of all he's got. At the end of the day, I think both Asugi and Saizo end up in C tier. They feel to me like the definition of bad filler. Both of them are workable, but they're not going to offer anything exceptional or unique. Well, in Saizo's case, he does have a unique build, but it is much higher investment than I would say the payoff is necessarily worth. Still fun and can be helpful on specific teams, but definitely not a general recommendation to go with the Exploding Man. As such, I have Saizo at the bottom of C tier, whereas Asugi is closer to the middle. The main thing holding him back is the combination of his low availability and the fact that he doesn't really offer anything as compared to some of the more standout children. His flexibility is quite nice, and it means that Asugi can fill in a lot of weak spots depending on who he has as a mom, but he's never going to do a job necessarily the best out of all the possible kids. Honestly, it's kind of fitting that at the end of the day, Saizo ended up in C tier for Christmas. And by coincidence, C tier's background is green, so we have the red and green Christmas after all. With that being said, if you celebrate any holidays this time of year, I hope you enjoy them, and otherwise I hope you stay warm. And if you're looking to give me a seasonal gift for our parasocial relationship, there is a link to my Patreon down below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem content. With that being said, I do want to say a special thank you to everyone currently subscribed to my Patreon. So, thank you, Glup Shido, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Cynthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Foogle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Ziggy WSB, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Control Aegis, Roman Kormanzik, Nick Knack Hammersmack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nap Caceres, Rockin' 2, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, A Clever Username of Lies, Jax McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Patwit, Pillow Willow, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Forever Lucas, Some Trades, Guichi555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Hound Dogs, They Thumb, Klon, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Adele, Alexander Roper, Sensitive Luigi, Siggy, and Lil Man. Thank you so much for your support, and have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers, and stay warm.